Thank you very much, and that's it's always difficult to hear your own bio. Anyway, I want to say thank you for inviting me, first of all, and I'm very pleased to be here. I don't have a few minutes, so I'll skip right into my presentation. And it didn't work. I'll skip that one. Quick advertisement about CAP. For those who don't know, CAP is the Canadian. Oops, sorry about that. CAP is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Kind of covered in my bio, we're all about promoting the upstream oil and gas industry, obviously, but we need to do that in a way that maintains our social license, and part of that, obviously, is the environment and society. I'm going to skip right into what I want to talk about today is the case for LNG and natural gas, and we represent the upstream industry. I want to talk about the global perspective, and the basic premise is that unambiguously natural gas is good for the environment in the context of the global demand for energy. So the International Energy Agency says energy demand is going to increase by 35% by 2035. And so we can ask ourselves, what is fundamentally driving that? And so you look at the colored wedges of this slide, and you might be struck by just how big the oil, gas, and coal slices are of that industry. And so we have to think about, going forward, is a low energy economy a possibility? And I would argue it is not a possibility. And by way of that, but is a low emissions planet possible? Impossibly, is what I would argue. And so when you look at this, what's driving this? Well, we look at the Asian economies, and we look at what's happening in Asia. This isn't necessarily being driven by North America, but by those economies that are growing: China, India, Korea, and even India. And eventually we'll see Africa coming on in a major way. And so to put this into context, we enjoy quality of life here in North America that is fueled, pardon the pun, by energy, and abundant energy, and affordable energy. If we look out in the future, there are 1 billion people today that don't have electricity. And so that future demand for energy is going to be there. And so as petroleum producers, we say, well, how will we meet that demand? And we would say, well, we will meet it by all sources of energy. It won't be just fossil fuels, and it won't be just renewables. We're going to need it all. But what's the best thing we can do to help meet that demand? And so looking forward, so it's not just the developing worlds too. There's also a fundamental reality. It does need to be affordable. And so when alternative fuels are not affordable, those economies won't develop. And it's not just about the developing world. Places like Europe are now substituting away from low environmental emission fuels and resubstituting coal, because natural gas is expensive in in Europe, excuse me. And so by case in point, Germany has now increased coal electricity production every year since 2009. But there's a juxtaposition to this, and that's because the relative price. But the juxtaposition of this, and the case is this: if we look at the United States, and we look at their coal, this is from the Department of Energy in the United States, we'll look at their millions of tons of CO2, and that's not all GHGs, but it's a good precursor. We'll see that there is a bend in that line. And I would argue, and I think it's fundamentally true, that that bend in the line starts to happen just about 2003. And that's just about the time that we saw natural gas, and particularly shale gas, come on stream in North America. And so we've had a radical redesign or a reformation of the market in North America, where natural gas was relatively scarce, relatively speaking. Then with the advent of new technology, horizontal drilling, and multiple stage hydraulic fracturing, the price of natural gas fell, and it started to displace coal in the United States. And we actually see that happening right about the same time that shale gas comes on. We see a very big dip, obviously, in 2009. That's the economic crisis, global economic crisis. But the really interesting stat in all of this, in 2012, the U.S. economy grew by about 2.5%. And energy demand fell by about 2.5%. And so it's the first time that that's really happened, that decoupling. And that has been brought about by the availability of natural gas. And so as a transition fuel in that world economy where we see a high energy world in the future, how do we achieve lower emissions? And I would argue that LNG and natural gas is the way to go forward. So this looks quickly at LNG has been rapidly expanding for the last several decades. It's tripled in the last 3 decades. The future for LNG is growing quite a bit. Believe it or not, there is about 30 BCF, billion cubic feet a day, of natural gas being traded on LNG tankers today. And BC has an abundant supply of natural gas. And in addition to that, our traditional markets for natural gas, I'm going to skip forward here. I'm going to go back one way. Our traditional markets for natural gas are falling. So the good news about natural gas is it's plentiful and abundant in North America. It is not plentiful and abundant and affordable in the rest of the planet yet. But the bad news for BC is our traditional markets are disappearing. And so the United States is now importing about 16% less gas today from Canada than they were 5 years ago. And they are actually starting to import natural gas into traditional markets that Western Canada has imported. So LNG is, on a business case, individually, fundamentally important market diversification for our industry in Western Canada. So I want to have a quick look at our British Columbia energy profile. And on the consumption side, I think this it certainly surprised me when I first saw it. We are considered, and we consider ourselves in British Columbia to be a clean economy. And yet a full 2/3 of the energy we consume, and this is when you compare them all by petajoules, 2/3 of the energy we consume right now is fossil fuel based. And so if you think about a jurisdiction like ours that has ready and abundant supply of natural gas, what can we, and I would argue too as well, we have that clean economy in part because of natural gas. And so if you flash back 50 or 60 years ago and you looked at Vancouver and said, how do we heat our homes in Vancouver? You'd be surprised that the answer was probably wood, coal, or oil. And 60 years ago, we built a pipeline from northeastern BC to Vancouver, and we bring natural gas here. And so natural gas, I'll admit, while more carbon intensive than hydro, has been part of our economy. And I would argue you couldn't strive to be the cleanest, greenest city in the world if it weren't for that legacy of natural gas. And so natural gas has shown that it can help Vancouver achieve emissions reductions and an aspirational goal. It has demonstrated that in North America, the U.S. has had the lowest GHG emissions in 20 years because of natural gas, and LNG will enable that as a world on a planetary level. And so the argument is simply that if we're going to have a high energy economy, how do we bend the curve to make it lower emissions? Natural gas is a clear way forward in that. So I quickly just want to look at where we consume natural gas. We only consume about 16% of what we produce. And I've already made this point, but the U.S., 41% goes to the U.S., 43% goes to the rest of Canada. The U.S. no longer needs our gas, or doesn't need as much of it. The rest of Canada doesn't need it as much as we used to. And so as an economy, and I'll get to this point in a minute, we need to think about what we can do and what does natural gas industry provide to the economy. This is the business case in part from the government's perspective. So a quick little advertisement here, and this may surprise many people. On average, the oil and gas industry invests $5 billion a year in the upstream oil and gas industry in British Columbia alone. We employ directly 12,000 people, and forecasting forward, we'll probably employ directly 40,000 people by 2035. It's not a small part of the economy. And so, case in point is, this is the part of the economy that, should LNG come on, could grow further. And so if you look at this from the government's perspective, what does that mean to the people of British Columbia? It's not the hugest number in the budget, but it's a sizable one. So this graph here shows natural gas royalties and land sales. And so for those who don't know, land sales are the right, you buy the right to explore for natural gas, and you pay a bonus bid for that. And so we actually see that traditionally natural gas has provided somewhere between 4 and 6% of the revenues to government, which again is not a big deal, but which 4 to 6% of the government's budget don't you want to live with, given that 3/4 of it is health and education. It's an important aspect. So if you're in the government's seat looking at the world and you look at the tail of that slide, you see that it's slipping off, and slipping off dramatically. And that is fundamentally because of the abundance of natural gas in North America. And so our traditional markets are disappearing. Government's losing a traditional source of revenue. What can we do to change that? I think I've argued that the environmental case is, well, there are more emissions associated with natural gas than perhaps hydro or wind energy. They're certainly less than 50% less than coal, and there's a world demand for this product. What can we do to help be part of that solution? And so that's where LNG comes in, and that's the business case from the government's perspective, is how can we achieve that?